Keeping in mind that this cartoon is showing you how the government under the United States Constitution is set up, the idea that there are 3 levels of the government, local is close to you, state is a little farther away, has a little more power, and the federal level takes care of laws for the entire United States. We are going to look into now the fact that power is split into different branches. So you see how this says branch. We're going to add a few ideas. Now you can find this sheet that I'm using as the second page of a packet that starts like this. So you'll want to find the second page. It says legislative branch. A couple of things we want to do first. Branch of what? This is the branch of United States government. You can abbreviate government. That apostrophe substitutes for the letters Governmen, and then there's your T. So the legislative branch of the U.S. government. How do we get this branch? It's set in the U.S. Constitution. That's the document that makes these rules. As we look then at the legislative branch of the United States government, first thing we need to think about is, who are they? Well, often, all together, the legislative branch, set in the U.S. Constitution, in the federal level, that would be in Washington, D.C. They are called Congress. So the legislative branch, if you hear people on the news talking about Congress, they are talking about the legislative branch. So this is just who. It's not yet what they do, it's who they are. The lower house, with a little less power in Congress, there are 2 parts of Congress. That's the A and the B. The one part is called the lower house. You'll hear it called the House of Representatives. Sometimes they're called representatives, sometimes they're called the House. A couple of important ideas here. The United States, under the Constitution, is not a democracy. We are a representative republic. That means we can stay at home and have our regular jobs, but every once in a while we have a chance to vote for people who go to Washington, D.C., or who go to Lansing, or even for the people who are the sheriff or who are the city council. We vote for those people to represent us in this branch of government. The House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. is elected every 2 years. The number of people in the House of Representatives is based on population of that state. So states that don't have very many people, Wyoming, North Dakota, Alaska, they are always guaranteed to have 2 representatives, but states like Michigan, with larger populations, with more people living here, have more representatives. This is why you hear a lot of talk on the news about the census and who should be counted and who should not be counted. If you count people in a state, that state has more power. And so this is why it becomes very, very interesting and very important to people who want their state to have more power. They want to count as many people as they possibly can. So the House of Representatives, The upper house, the other legislative branch at the federal level in Washington, D.C., is called the Senate. They are known as the upper house because they have a bit more power. Once they are elected, they have their job for 6 years. So in the House of Representatives, they have to keep the people who elect them a little bit happier because they have to get reelected every 2 years. In the Senate, once they are elected, they keep their job for 6 years. And here, there are only 2 senators for each state. Why would there only be 2 senators for each state? Well, you see, when the Constitution was being written, there was some argument. Actually, there was a lot of argument. When they were writing the Constitution, they weren't even sure they were going to manage to come out of it with a Constitution. Finally, there was a compromise because the little states, when they were writing the Constitution, said, if we only get to send a number of representatives to the federal level based on how many people live in our state, Virginia's going to have a ton of power, and we, little tiny Rhode Island, will never be able to make any sort of difference. So the small states said the way things were in the House of Representatives based on the population of the state was unfair to them. But the big states like Virginia said it was unfair for them if little tiny Rhode Island, who only had a few people, was able to have an equal amount of power in making laws. So Rhode Island wanted this plan. The big states like Virginia wanted this plan. And they were sort of stuck until somebody suggested, why don't we do it both? Why don't we have representation based on population so the big states can have a little more power in one place? In another place, we have representation equal for every state. And then when the legislative branch does its job, which is to make laws, we'll get there in a moment, when the legislative branch does its job to make laws, those laws have to pass in both houses of Congress. Once they came to that compromise, they were able to go ahead with the Constitution. So this was called the Great Compromise, realizing that, all right, we've got to have the little states not overpowered by the big ones, but we can't have the little states so much more powerful that the big ones don't get to look out for their larger number of citizens. That is how there came to be 2 different houses in Congress. Now we get to the idea that the legislative branch has jobs. Their first and most important job, put a star here, this is really your shortcut. If you are ever asked on a test what the legislative branch does, they make laws. You can have a president in the executive branch say he wants a law, but according to the United States Constitution, only the legislative branch with representatives from every state is supposed to make laws. So the Constitution is very clear on saying who has the power to make laws, and it is not the president or judges for that matter. The legislative branch gets to declare war, and the legislative branch gets to approve executive, that would be the president's, appointees. So if the president wants someone to do a job, like to be on the Supreme Court or to be a part of his cabinet to give him advice, or if the president wants someone to be able to represent us for the United Nations, or be a diplomat and go to other nations and tell them the way the United States sees things. He gets to appoint them, but the legislative branch has to agree that they are good for the job. So that's what it means to approve executive appointees. Finally, we get to the idea that there are checks and balances. So if something is balanced, that means it's equal. One side is not heavier than the other. But the way you keep it in check is one side pulls equally against the other. So you can almost envision a little tug of war between these two as well. So there are checks and balances between all three branches of government. These will make more sense as we talk about the other branches of government. Right now, it won't make as much sense because this is our first branch of government. Although this should be reviewed from 3rd and 4th grade, I do not assume that you remember it all. So in the legislative branch, laws must be passed by... I confused myself. Laws that were passed or that are passed. How about we say that have been? There we get the correct tense. So once the legislative branch has passed laws, they must be two things. Signed by the executive. That would be the president, and we'll abbreviate. Or okay, now wait a minute. Vetoed. Confused myself again, didn't I? The idea of being vetoed is explained more down here in number 2. Okay, so a veto is when the executive branch says no law, says the president. He doesn't like a law. Now, the legislative branch can overturn a veto. So the president says no law, the legislative branch then can overturn that veto by a super majority. Now the interesting thing is the rules about vetoes and overturning and how that works, the rules, even as we speak, Congress has found ways to change its rules to make it easier or harder for certain things to happen depending on who is in power. But the Constitution does lay out the groundwork for the fact that these things can happen. A little bit more about the checks and balances. The executive branch can check, so this is a check by the executive. They can pull against the power of the legislative branch. But that check is balanced because the legislative branch can pull back and say, no, we disagree with your veto. Now we're going to get another branch involved. This is a way that the check comes by the judicial branch. So the judicial branch can say the laws are declared unconstitutional, not agreeing with the Constitution. That's what we write down here. They go against the Constitution. Just the U.S. Constitution, not any other country's constitution. Laws may be declared unconstitutional by the judicial branch. When that happens, they are then not a law. So if the judicial branch says that a law goes against the Constitution, that law is no longer allowed to be. This last one is actually a check by the legislative branch itself. Here's how it works. This is called impeachment. And any elected official who is in office can be removed, which means basically unelected, if found guilty of what are called high crimes and treasons. When they wrote the Constitution, they were afraid that sometimes someone would get elected and then would start taking the power too far and thinking they didn't have to obey the law. Thus, they wanted to be able to not punish that elected official by putting them in jail. That's a totally different step, and that's run by the judicial system. But the founders did want to make sure that if an elected official who was in office at the time, they could be removed from the office, so they could not stay elected if they were found guilty of high crimes and treason. So not things like getting a speeding ticket would get impeachment. The Constitution, the writers of the Constitution thought it was very important to be very careful and very specific about how impeachment would work, and so they put a lot of details about who could be impeached. It was only someone in office who was elected that could be impeached, and only if they were found guilty of high crimes and treasons. Make sure that you have these notes, and then you should be able to go back and answer as well on this sheet, number 6 and 7 and 8. Again, you need complete sentences. What is the main job of the legislative branch? Is there a federal, state, and local level? In other words, are there lawmakers in Washington, D.C.? Are there lawmakers in Lansing? Are there people who make rules and city ordinances in Ithaca? And so this one would say there is a federal, state, and local level of the legislative branch, or there is not a federal, state, and local level of the legislative branch. You must use all of these words in your answer. Number 8, what is one way the legislative branch can check the power of another branch to keep that branch from getting too much power? So a check by the executive is not something the legislative branch can do. But when the legislative branch can overturn a veto, that is the way it can check the executive branch. The fact that the executive branch can say who they want to appoint, the legislative branch can check that power by saying, no, we don't think they'd be good for the job. So that is one way the legislative branch checks the executive branch. The legislative branch can check itself. It can check the executive branch. It can check the judicial branch by using impeachment. If an elected official is currently in office and they are found guilty of high crimes and treasons, they can just unelect the person. So that should give you some idea of what to put for number 8. You do not need to include all of those. Your homework assignment is to send me the photograph of this completed sheet. Thank you.